Hi, everyone. Welcome to our BC Wine Grape Council third Thursday R&D presentation for February, the longest month of the year, officially. Today we have Dr. Hannah Charnock with us to present. Hannah holds a PhD in enology and viticulture from Brock University, where her research focused on the chemistry of sparkling wine aging. She recently completed a postdoctoral appointment at the University of Bordeaux, conducting industry research on red wine aroma composition and sensory interactions. Her background includes harvests at premium sparkling wine producers in the UK and industry leadership experience in sensory science and quality systems at Phillips Brewing and Malting Company. Hannah holds her WSET Level 3 and a certificate in wine business management from the Goodman School of Business. She also told me that she's getting pretty fluent in French, so if you want to ask questions in French at the end, that would be fun. Thanks for joining us, Hannah. I'll let you take it over.
Yeah, no problem. So today, it looks like this is maybe a little bit of a different presentation than what I've seen third Thursdays. But today I'm going to be talking about a research proposal through MyTax that myself and Professor John Volpe, who's in the crowd here too, are talking about as being sort of an upcoming and exciting research concept looking at tracking provincial sparkling wine harvest chemistry, as well as characterizing chemical and sensory qualities of BC bubbles. So to begin, there we go. So an introduction of today, I'm going to go over introducing myself. I know there's a little bit of a background there, but I'll just give you some context as to who I am and why I want to do this. And then the UVic Eco-Gastronomy Group at UVic that this research is in partnership with. I'll then go into a background, as I'm sure we all know, the opportunity of what the global sparkling wine market looks like, as well as the Canadian and specifically the BC industry. And then I'll get into the project proposal. So the aim here is industry-focused research, which is also the backing of the funding body, MyTax, is all using fund matching to support industry research. So with this, as I mentioned, it's the harvest chemistry compilation of data, sensory identity, and chemical characterization of BC sparkling. And then I'll just talk a little bit at the end about deliverables and industry engagement from this, including the database of harvest chemistry and then resources, as well as that outreach component to industry. So my background, I moved from Winnipeg to Victoria back in 2013 and got a taste for the West Coast, and it's very nice. So I did my bachelor's in chemistry at UVic. And then during that time, I also did some applied sensory and consumer science courses at the University of California, Davis through their online extension program. And shortly after, I got my sort of first taste in the wine industry, working at Three Sisters Winery in Penticton and Earlco for a co-op during my undergrad degree from January till May, doing viticulture and lab work. And then I moved on to Phillips Brewing and Malting Company in Victoria, where I stayed for several years. It's I'm sure many of us are familiar with the brand. It's BC's largest craft brewery, and it has a on-site malting facility, which is the only operation of its kind like that in North America. And through that role, I was the senior quality analyst and sensory lead and was able to get involved in a lot of great industry academic collaborations through the University of Victoria, as well as Camosun College. And there's a photo there of our lab team working with Dr. Fraser Hoff at the University of Victoria. So we did that through NSERC Engage and MyTax. So I'm familiar with industry academic funding models, and it's been really great to sort of see their successes over several years of different projects. And throughout this time that I was at Phillips, I also simultaneously worked elsewhere, including Blue Grouse Estate Winery up in Cowichan. This was part-time to carry out some lab equipment calibrations and just sort of enjoyed the brewing world, but wanted to stay in the wine sector. Afterwards, I moved to Southern Ontario, to Niagara, to do my PhD in enology and viticulture at Brock University's Cool Climate Enology and Viticulture Institute. And this was focused on traditional methods, sparkling wine aging chemistry with researchers Belinda Kemp and Gary Pickering. I know a lot of people in the Canadian sparkling wine world are very familiar with Belinda because of her Fizz Club outreach. So it was really nice to get that exposure, also of the academic research that has an industry impact. As was mentioned, I then went back into industry, did two back-to-back harvests due to regional variation and grape maturity in the UK at Gusbourne Estate Winery and The Grange. Got my forklift license and got to do a bunch of hard work after doing a bunch of academic work. Got to use my body and do manual labor, and that was great. And then went on to the University of Bordeaux, the Institute of Vine and Wine Science, where I worked on red wine enology and sensory science as a postdoctoral researcher. So the research that we're proposing here is in collaboration with the Eco-Gastronomy Research Group at the University of Victoria that's headed by Professor John Volpe, who's a professional cook and somm with decades of biological conservation research. And the group uses quantitative data and empirical evidence of food and wine production systems to investigate complex ways that agricultural practices influence environment, social sustainability, product composition, sensory outcomes, and the primacy of place. And some outputs from this lab include the EcoSoil Lab, which evaluates vineyard manipulation, which is dedicated to research collaborations that consider the role of soil biology and agricultural activities through extension research and analytical services, as well as recent work on the influence of vineyard manipulations on Pinot Gris chemical composition. That was a recent master's degree out of this lab. So now onto the project that we're interested in. As many of us know, the global sparkling wine market is doing very well, especially compared to a lot of other sectors of the wine industry that are struggling. And according to the most recent sparkling wine report by the International Organization of Vine and Wine from 2020, the sector is experiencing rapid growth. It was 57% global production growth between 2002 and 2018, demonstrating sustained demand for both production as well as the consumer end. And overall, sparkling wine represents about 8% of global wine production, with emerging international production zones. Obviously, this is primarily concentrated in the EU, but these international production zones include places like cool climate regions, like the UK, which I was in before, as well as the Canadian market. And this trend is also mirrored in Canada, where sparkling wine is the fastest growing sales category, generates over 630 million annually, and domestic products represent only 30% of this figure. As a result, Canada is a very large wine importing country. It's the fifth largest by volume, according to the OIV, and these imports have increased by 11% in value and 21% in volume year over year between 2021 and 2022, excuse me. So all of these figures sort of point towards the potential for domestic growth to capture part of this market share because of that demand. And as we know here in Canada, our primary wine production is concentrated between the Okanagan Valley in BC and the Niagara Peninsula in southern Ontario, in addition to other sub and smaller regions spanning coast to coast in other parts of BC, Ontario, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. Now, data is very readily available for Ontario, and I have it's a little bit old, 2022 vintage data, but we do have information on what percentage of grapes harvested are destined for different types of wine production, and 10% of harvest products are destined for sparkling in Ontario. In addition, there's also an increase in total volume of sparkling produced, consistent with global trends as well as sales trends within Canada. Also, production is increasing with over 250,000 cases produced in the 2022 vintage. Now, the same resolution of this kind of data, from what I can tell, isn't available in BC, but looking at comparable stats from the BC Liquor Distribution Branch, here's a graph that I put together of total BC wine sales in the orange bars, and then the small blue bars are the BC sparkling wine within the overall BC category. We can see that over the course of the most recent 12-month period, BC sparkling specifically is worth about 25 million. And the ratio of BC sparkling to total BC wine sales is increasing. That's the green line that you can see across that chart, is showing that the ratio of people that are purchasing BC sparkling to overall BC product is on the rise. So clear growth in production and consumption globally, nationally, and also regionally demonstrates that research on sparkling wine stands to benefit industry growth and innovation and agricultural potential. Now, the BC sparkling region has been widely recognized for its current and past successes, as well as its future potential. And this is spread across all of the geographical indications within BC. However, BC producers face a unique combination, as we know, of cool climate pressures and extreme weather events. And these factors substantially influence fruit chemistry and ultimately the expression of finished wines. And limited research is available on the composition, both chemically and sensorially, of wines from our province in terms of sparkling. And this knowledge gap, in turn, limits the industry's ability to coordinate research, identify regional traits, monitor climate effects in terms of the impact on the final product. And this can also be used to support market positioning. So the project that we're proposing is sort of a two-phase project to provide additional information and resources and data to the industry. So the first part of this is compiling a database or a data set of harvest chemistry for key sparkling wine varieties. And this is due to these significant vintage to vintage variability driven by climate pressures. But as far as I know, there's currently no central framework in terms of what harvest chemistry is and how it fluctuates year over year in BC's diverse wine growing regions. So to address this gap, we aim to compile, organize, and visualize finished harvest chemistry data, or like final harvest chemistry data, for key sparkling varieties, including Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Meunier, and then Pinot Gris. And this will provide a status of the harvest chemistry in terms of Brix, TA, pH, and organic acids. And these parameters are important to grape growers and winemakers in making crucial viticulture and harvest decisions that are fundamental for grape and wine quality. Obviously, because this is sort of retrospective of compiling data after it's the final harvest choice, it's helpful for looking back year over year on what that data looked like, as well as providing a foundation for future longitudinal studies across and within the diverse wine growing regions. Many global wine regions, including Niagara, California, Champagne, and others, collect and or publish seasonal maturity reports, including standard harvest chemistry. Not specifically for sparkling, but sparkling is sort of like a bite-sized way to start this data collection, obviously with benefit to the rest of this project. And this proposal suggests just final harvest data due to the scale and scope of the funding proposal. But other regions do have harvest monitoring leading up to maturity for indices that can be potentially a future expansion opportunity for this part of the project. And I've included some screen grabs from the Innovent's Napa Harvest Watch platform, just sort of what this could look like. So they report the harvest data for Brix, pH, total acidity, and malic acid. You can see for each variable how many submissions go into calculating these results to give you sort of an average snapshot of what's happening within the region, as well as obviously a year-over-year comparison. And their platform also has regional resolution so that you can filter by sub-AVAs, looking at sort of what that data is used for. They also have filters in there for grape variety. I think there's some other metrics in there as well, but having the resolution to look at data from within the province of harvest chemistry and then sort of parse it out by grape variety, subregion, etc. So as I mentioned, the idea is to target sparkling wine varieties of Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Meunier, and Pinot Gris. And then where available, start collecting historical data to begin vintage comparisons. And this is obviously all based on winemakers and wineries being interested in sharing this data with us. The idea here is to compile this data for long-term industry use, sort of as I showed, a platform that you can host that data that's secure and scalable and can potentially integrate additional data sets in the future, like that geospatial information, potentially also climate variables. So using a system, a relational database that offers this kind of flexibility and integration potential is the idea for this. It also has opportunities for future expansion of looking at additional varieties that are destined for sparkling and also harvest chemistry for still wines. As I mentioned, many of these programs that exist aren't at, I don't think, any other than Champagne are specifically designed for sparkling chemistry, but expanding to other wines is obviously an opportunity here. As well as I mentioned, that pre-harvest monitoring data is quite popular in these kind of systems as well, so that people can sort of get a live update of what that looks like during the harvest season. Another future potential expansion opportunity is using comparative data from other Canadian wine growing regions. Niagara has this harvest monitoring program, so that data is available, as well as other regions like Quebec and Nova Scotia are sort of starting to do this. So the outcome here is a specialized sparkling wine data tool that provides insight on climate and regional effects and positions BC as a leader in data-driven cool climate wine research with, of course, longevity planning. Because the MyTax project is a discrete period of time, it would also need to include clear data submission requirements from wineries and then also considerations of how this could be handed off and grown in the years to come. The second part of this proposal is BC sparkling wine sensory and chemical benchmarking, which is what a lot of my background is. So aroma is the primary indicator of sparkling wine quality, and a key consideration in consumer purchasing behavior. We know that aroma is a very complex phenomenon that's from complex interactions between biological, chemical, and human components. And these are linked to things like grape variety, fruit maturity, terroir, production method, yeast strain, and aging time, among others. There's so many variables in sparkling production. But despite extensive research that's focused on identifying volatile compounds that contribute to aroma in sparkling wines, to our knowledge, no current research has investigated the sensory and chemical composition of wines from British Columbia. This work aims to therefore generate a first comprehensive sensory and chemical characterization of commercial products from BC. And this is aimed to deliver immediate industry value, seeing how the wines are described across the province, what their associations are with chemical composition, and also establish this data foundation that can support longer-term R&D and future expansion of this research stream to really grow the enology capacity within the province. This part of the project is proposed to take place in 3 phases. The first two leveraging sensory science methods to carry out profiling, followed by a chemical analysis of wines to measure aroma compounds and standard wine chemistry. This is sort of a typical way to do wine sensory research, is to bring in experts or people that are very highly trained and familiar with wine things. This could be winemakers, importers, somms, just people that are very familiar with wine to sort of set a baseline understanding of what are the key factors that we're finding among these products, and then moving to a more general consumer base where consumers can provide information just on their recognition of some of these compounds. We know that consumers aren't necessarily generally able to highlight all of these very complex nuances within a wine, but it allows us to understand what of these aroma qualities the consumer is able to recognize. And then finally, chemical characterization allows for us to integrate the sensory and chemical drivers. So as I mentioned, these 2 parts of sensory research are both serve different purposes and are both very important. And in all sensory research, the wines are served blind, ideally all commercial wines that are contributed to the research, so nobody knows what they're consuming. And then there's obviously duplicates worked into there so that we can assess the reliability of these panels as well. So the analysis that happens in each panel, as I mentioned, is different according to their expertise. So from the expert group, we'd like to collect information on both the presence and intensity of specific descriptors, as well as sensory groupings of commercial wines to find out if there potentially are any regional traits that sort of categorize a group of sparkling wines together, as well as obviously things like the variety of grape that's being used in production. Those kind of things are going to discern those sensory groupings. On the other hand, from consumers, it's an opportunity to collect demographic information about their wine involvement, their level of wine knowledge, consumption habits, their typical spend per bottle, their preferences in wines. And then in BC wines themselves, their ability to recognize selected aroma descriptors in those products. It's a unique opportunity to have some information on what the consumers that are in the province that are driving those BC LDB stats of BC sparkling being a growing category within BC wines, of what they're interested in or looking for or have purchased in the past. In a lot of sparkling wine research, the terms that are used to define these different aromatic groupings come from work that's done with traditional varieties of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Meunier. So due to the diversity of production methods, varieties and blends, and styles that are produced across BC, this vocabulary is unlikely to be inclusive of a lot of the wines that are produced within the province. So the aim is to use this expert panel to expand the vocabulary to capture the diversity of wines that are being evaluated, to make sure that it's representative of the samples being evaluated for sensory research. And those terms are later used for panel training and to investigate the relationship between the volatile aromatic compounds in the wines and the expression of aroma attributes. All sensory research will take place in sensory evaluation rooms. We do have one available at the University of Victoria, and this is a photo from a recent tasting at the Vessel tasting room here on the island, but also the opportunity to bring this potentially to the Okanagan so that we can have different winemaker involvement and participation in these panels. With sensory research, we want to make sure that the people that we have included in data collection as our panelists are from a balanced demographic, especially for the consumer panel, making sure that we're capturing a range of age and wine habits and all of these things to sort of have a representative population sample in there. And sensory sessions will evaluate the presence and intensity of defined aroma characteristics from that expanded vocabulary of terms. And this will be using things like quantitative descriptive analysis with the expert panel, as well as things like check all that apply, where you put a check mark beside each of the descriptors that you perceive in the sample for our consumer panel, and then preference testing as well to provide novel insight for BC producers. And then next, the chemical analysis will include standard wine chemistry like pH, TA, alcohol, SO2, CO2, pressure, etc., as well as a quantitative profile of select volatile aroma compounds of interest. And this is targeting things like esters, C13 neurosoprenoids, and C6 alcohols using a GCMS method that I've worked with in the past. And this is just a way to capture a lot of these volatile compounds that are representative of those different aroma families, and then relate it back to sensory qualities. So later, statistical analysis links the chemical and the sensory data together to provide insight into aroma qualities that are linked to regional terroir or climate, varietal selection, and other production methods. Since I'm sure that's a little bit difficult to visualize what that might look like, I just put an insert of data from the project that I was working on in Bordeaux. This just gives you sort of an example of how you can collect really sort of interesting insights from the combination of sensory and chemical data. And here it was a study where we had 4 wines. There's 5 total, but one of them we ended up removing, but there's wines, and then there's wines that had higher concentrations of ester compounds particularly. And in doing this analysis to combine the sensory results with the chemical results, we could find 2 discrete groupings of how these wines are perceived based on their chemical composition. So the circle in yellow on the left or orange on the left were wines that had higher ester content, were associated with fresh fruit and floral and red fruit aroma characteristics, whereas those wines just on their own without that adjustment had more of a black fruit, vegetal, jammy fruit quality. So this is just an example of sort of what this data might end up looking like, but it's a way to parse out groupings based on chemical and sensory data. So the outcomes of this part of the proposal are detailing some evidence-based insight into unique regional identities across BC's wine regions and giving some industry-focused research with tastings and providing potential compositional features that are impacted by viticultural or enological control. So things like if there's certain esters that we find are higher in certain wines, and perhaps those are preferred or not preferred, we can link that back to where the origin of these compounds comes from in the chain of wine production. So this outreach allows us to take results from an academic standpoint and make sure that it's meaningful to industry. Sensory outcomes can be leveraged to potentially support strategic marketing positioning and product placement, knowing what consumers are interested in, what they typically purchase, as well as what flavor characteristics are found across the wines. Can be like a really nice insight for producers and wineries to have. And then finally, from the academic world, producing peer-reviewed publications and scientific knowledge transfer to contribute to R&D for our industry and also regional visibility. So for those who aren't familiar, Mitacs is a funding organization within Canada that is designed to drive industry and academic collaborations by fund matching. So Mitacs and an industry partner come together to each contribute to 50% of the research project or the fellowship value. So this is being proposed as a 12-month postdoctoral Mitacs Accelerate, which is their funding model for postdoctoral researchers. And the funding component from the partner organization is between $30,000 and $37,500 dollars plus tax, which is applied to the researcher salary, which is myself, as well as the research costs to facilitate this work. So obviously the research that's proposed is quite ambitious for a 12-month Mitacs. A lot of those things sort of depend on the interest from the industry and the impact that is anticipated from those projects. But just so you know, this is sort of just a proposal to spark a lot of ideas of things that we think are interesting and think could be beneficial. So the way that the funding itself works is there's sort of two different options. The standard Accelerate program is the one that requires the 30,000 plus tax partner contribution. In this case, the proposal is to the BC Wine Grape Council. And then intermittently, Mitacs offers a promotional funding offer where they offer a greater support with fund matching. Those are on an intermittent basis, but that is the 37,500 Accelerate funding offer. So that one is on a time interval, whereas the standard Accelerate is a rolling submission period. At any point, you can submit a proposal and collect feedback from Mitacs and aim to secure funding. And it's also noted that postdoctoral researchers can leverage Mitacs funding for a maximum of 3 years. So this work has a few different deliverables and engagement that I mentioned. The first being the harvest chemistry data tool, something that can exist within the industry, be referenced in future years, and also help to just build a data set of information to inform growth and climate information for our region. The second part is industry knowledge transfer and tasting. So these photos here are from Fizz Club in Ontario when I was doing my PhD. Belinda Kemp ran this wonderful organization that would get people together, winemakers from all across Canada, sparkling winemakers specifically, and it was an opportunity to give research updates on what's happening in the academic world, what's happening in industry, any questions that producers have that potentially either the group or the access to an academic could help. So it was a really great way to get people together. I know that she did do one, maybe two BC editions in the past, but now she's back in the UK. And something like this, I think there's a lot of interest every time I talk to winemakers of just getting people together to discuss challenges and successes, and then also to taste wines from yourself and your colleagues in sort of a controlled environment of collecting information for yourselves. So the overall arc of the project is to produce foundational research that is region specific, with the aim of informing strategic growth, potentially attracting future investment, and enhancing the resilience and competitiveness of BC's sparkling wine sector. Now, I moved through this presentation much quicker than I thought I would, so there's lots of time for questions and discussion if anyone has anything that they'd like to ask or add.
Thanks, Hannah. I was gonna make the, slow down sign, but it wasn't so fast that we couldn't follow for sure. But
Great.
um, yeah, do we have any questions? If you just at this point, we're few enough, you can just unmute and speak up. I know there's some sparkling wine producers here that might have questions. All right, I'm going to ask you a question. So when you're talking about harvest data, and Brix is like a large component of that. However, with sparkling wine, the pick date is often determined by the Brix, right? It's picked earlier. So I think that like the data set needs to include harvest date, because I think that's more significant than the actual Brix, right? Because
Yeah,
you're going to find the Brix is all the same.
great. That's yeah.
Yeah. Anybody have anything to say about that?
That's actually really interesting. When I was in Champaign last year and they had one of the producers I went to had a calendar of what the pick date was every year for the last 40 years.
Yeah,
Had shifted by like over 20 days or something. Like it was
really.
a wild, like now they're picking sort of early September and before it was, like mid to late August sometime.
Yeah.
Like it's just or
And do they,
they're picking earlier rather than later, but it's just so interesting that like it's shifted so dramatically. So I agree that
yeah,
data on there would be
it would be interesting to see the trend lines on that, right? Yeah.
Would it
Um, Sebastian.
Yeah, would it be important to also, like even I do two styles of sparkling wine, right? Ancestral and traditional.
Hmm.
And clearly there are different picking styles. So for the data, make sure like maybe if you're doing traditional, Charmat or First Carbo, whatever.
yeah,
So then we can also see if trends on that aspect too.
great. That's really helpful insight. Yeah, the idea is to have enough resolution within that data set that it's usable by anyone who would want to, so I agree that filtering down by that also within region, obviously with the temperatures of the growing season impacting different regions, it would be nice to have some climate growing degree data in there as well to see vintage to vintage what that looks like and how that impacts those factors.
Hmm. So ideally, when would this funding start?
It's a rolling submission for the funding. So
Mhm.
it just depends on getting matching funds,
Right.
interest in that angle of it. And then it's, I think, quite a quick turnaround period. It sounds like it's 6 to 8 weeks is what they've quoted me in the past. And then the project commences, is how it works. And
Mhm.
then my understanding is that the way that my tax operates is that should you get close to the end of your current funding that's been approved and wish to extend it, that's relatively straightforward as well. So it's quite a flexible funding model that allows for a lot of change in terms of the scope of the project and what becomes a priority as things move along, as well as expanding it to become a larger project should it need to.
So you're kind of relying on there being a range of vintages commercially available. Is that right? At the point that you
Yeah, so
yeah.
for some things, I think the chemical and sensory benchmarking of wines can be done on any vintage of wine. Obviously, some of those aging markers are going to evolve in the bottle over time, but still developing information on how the wines age within BC is also an important insight to sort of have the time post bottling or post disgorging in there as well. So obviously with the way that the industry is right now, having several vintages that have been quite challenging, that's not necessarily always possible. Um, but it isn't totally contingent on having that available, especially the harvest database side of things. Provided that wineries are willing to share their information from however many past harvests they're willing to offer that information for. Um, Starting to compile that information is sort of just an additional resource for when future vintages come up and to have that data all together.
Right. Mary McDermott has asked, what would you be looking for from wineries who wish to participate in the research? You should answer her. She she makes a lot of sparkling wine.
Great. Um, I mean, I need to put together sort of like a detailed plan, but the idea would be in-kind contributions of bottles so that they can be used for chemical and sensory analysis. Involvement in tastings if there's interest to be one of the expert panelists, especially having a winemaker perspective in there is really important. And then their interest in participating in that industry outreach component of a Fizz Club style model, what they think is important to get from this work, what future direction they think it could go in, or what sort of a platform would be beneficial. So it's sort of like an insight, wine, and time package from wineries that are interested.
Right. Well, yeah. Put Mary's name down.
Great.
She's interested. I'll contribute her wine. So, all right, you talk about organic acids at harvest. So, I'm assuming that's tartaric and malic. Do you have anything else in mind?
Tartaric and malic and acetic are the ones that I've seen previously in harvest monitoring programs. I know the Niagara, CAVI, the Cool Climate Enology and Viticulture Institute there, their pre-harvest monitoring program includes acetic acid as a metric. But it sort of depends on the region and what you're looking for. For sparkling, it would be primarily malic and tartaric that we're interested in, or whatever information wineries have. I know it's not necessarily always uniform. Some people might just
Yeah,
have pA data and pH and Brix, and that's great too. So it's sort of a combination of what people have and what's most useful.
right. I mean, more and more wineries have FOSS
Yeah.
capability, so they probably could give you, you know, a full range
Yeah.
of questionable data. um, Recently, I've been told, and I believe it because it was said with authority, that succinic acid is important in terms of the perception of minerality.
I've heard that too. I mean, I think minerality in general sort of sends the wine science community for a bit of a tailspin.
Totally, totally. Makes
But
our head explode. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. It's like,
yeah,
what is it?
yeah.
But yeah, I've seen that. I don't know exactly much more detail on that, but
No,
I mean, any metrics that wineries have that they're willing to share can be included in that kind of a data compilation. So if they do have succinic acid data, if they have anything else, tonnage potentially, or just anything that adds a resolution is still going to be helpful in compiling that information.
right. Um, and we've had like recently we've had mad swings in vintages,
Yeah,
right? So I mean, especially in 21 when we had the heat dome,
yeah,
I think there'd be some interesting data there. And yeah, I think also that the as you said, this is developing a framework that then can be used for other wine styles and other, you know, and
yeah.
over a whole range of varieties. It's just like starting to collect the data, I think would be um, really useful. And the
Yeah, and I think
structure, the data structure, right?
And I think in a lot of ways, sparkling wine is the hardest thing to start with because there are so many variables of, the blends that are happening instead of it being single varietal. The
Mm.
production methods are varied. Like there's a lot of factors that complicate doing this work with sparklings. I think in some ways it's sort of starting with the hardest thing, but potentially
Yeah,
has the
it's
greatest
true.
potential for reward, given the way that the market is going with sparkling. Also, I think is a good proof of concept of if with the most difficult wine style, if this is possible and impactful, then it's going to be that much easier to be collecting data for table wine, especially single varietal wines. That will be infinitely easier in the
Yeah,
future to have that both the
yeah.
framework and sort of the step down in difficulty for some of those things.
Daniel, you have a question, comment, please?
Yes, hi. Dan Bender from the University of Toronto, and I really like the presentation. It's really exciting, and I particularly like the connection between the kind of the the quantitative and the qualitative is really useful. And I was wondering if there's part of the outcomes here really does specifically to sparkling wine is the is how we present the idea of the use of reserve wines. And I don't honestly know how much that is done and how far the reserves go back in British Columbia. They're they don't go that far back here in Ontario. But it is one way of thinking about those as climate adaptations, which
Totally.
really does change the story of how we think about non-vintage.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean that's historically what non-vintage has been best at is mitigating vintage effects and climate effects. The power of blending and the power of reserve wines. So I do agree. I don't know what the sort of average, I don't even know if there necessarily would be an average, but what different producers are doing in terms of their reserve wines and age. I think that's probably another part of this project in the industry outreach component and sort of that Fizz Club setting that could be really interesting to explore. I know I think it was the 2022, it must have been kind of just post-ish COVID meeting. It was a base wine tasting. I think it's also just interesting for people to get together and taste side by side a bunch of different producers' base wines, things that you don't necessarily always have a platform to get together and discuss and taste. And I think reserve wines is another really good example of that.
I fully agree. I think it'd be really useful to get that information about what people are hoping to do
Yeah.
with reserve wines in this context. Yeah, great. Thanks.
No problem. I think that's also something where the industry is obviously very ambitious and there's a lot of very talented producers and excellent ideas and excellent product. But having sort of a platform to become even more ambitious with that and have your questions answered and discussed with your colleagues, I think that sort of is a great platform for accelerating the growth of the industry even further.
Mary?
Yeah, I was going to say you're tackling a beast for sure, because not only is there non-vintage and vintage and different varietals and blends, but there's also time on lees differentials, dosage differentials,
Yeah.
that'll make the flavors of those finished wines different. I wonder if it's a way that would the starting point be just assessing base wines to start and then moving on, or
It totally could be. I think the complication with, I mean, obviously sparkling wine is inherently all of these variables do make it more complicated, but the consumer component of what they spend, what they like, flavors that they can pick out in wines, I think has like a very sort of quick impact, but it's like such novel information for the industry that it I think could be very, very valuable. Whereas with base wine, you're limited back down to just sort of that expert data. Not that it's better or worse, but I think that that's something in the future that for sure makes a ton of sense. That's like starting at the start before things get really complicated. And
yeah, because like the harvest parameters would be more important
yes,
in regards to base wines,
for sure.
but obviously they don't taste great necessarily for consumers. So
Yeah,
we would give the consumers for sure finished wines. Uh, and also, I think it's super exciting. I'm super excited that you're actually come out here to do this. So I'm happy to see it. Woo!
Um, let's see. I didn't jot down any more questions.
I know we also have Professor John Volpe is here from UVic from the lab that I'm working with. I don't know if John, you want to speak to the eco-gastronomy group or the
Yes,
project.
I'm
please.
happy to hi everybody. I'm happy to take questions if there's interest, but I don't want to distract from the conversation. So just happy to kind of be here, and thank you all for taking the time.
So do you have established sort of database structures that you've been using for other products?
I'm not a database expert. I feel like
Yeah,
within that part of the project, John actually had a bit more insight on how to best structure things to make sure that they're flexible and accessible and all
yeah.
of these things. But I have used these types of databases before from like the user side, but not from the producer side. So I think it would be primarily sort of collecting the data, cleaning the data, and then heavily consulting with John of what our steps are to make this accessible. But maybe John can speak to that.
Yeah, we do. With the advancement the technology, the democratization of SQL and other platforms for this kind of data gathering storage. I won't say it's easy, but it's nowhere near as complicated as, say, it was 5 or more years ago, where it really did call for some highly skilled technical folks to get involved in. And you end up having to go back to these people to make any small changes. And now the world has changed such that we can build. I'm confident we can build it, modify it, tailor it, and optimize it through time um, as needs or desires grow.
I'm assuming that there's some AI kind of opportunities there. I hate to say that, but
Yeah. Well, hey, in the academy, AI is a daily conversation.
yeah,
Both the double-edged sword nature of it, and that's certainly part of the opportunity to engage AI to build these modules that again might have previously required some specific or highly trained specialists. That said, we're I, at least personally, am very cautious, and as soon as anything with AI comes up, to make sure that we're actually focusing on what we should be focusing on and not getting or increasing exposure to things that might come back and bite us down the road.
I'm sure we could get some cat videos like drinking champagne and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
A cat consumer panel. I think key to the industry would be designing the data analysis so that it is expandable, right? So that it can then cover, all these other variables that we're talking about, right? And 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 I think probably especially with the greatest interest is in vintage variation these days, right?
Right.
So I think also there's probably an opportunity for new varieties that would be conducive to sparkling wine. Like if there's, people are talking about planting cold hardy hybrids and that sort of thing, right? And certainly in Nova Scotia, there's been work done on that.
Yeah.
So I know people are kind of looking in that direction. So keeping sort of an eye on that and open to that.
Yeah, I think that's sort of like even more of a thing where there's very little foundational data on a lot of these hybrids for use in sparkling. It's just like a lot of this data, someone needs to start collecting it for there to be a baseline to then evaluate down the road.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. I think that's probably the direction that a lot of people are thinking about, at least given the last few years.
And I think you should include Riesling.
Yeah.
Mary has a killer sparkling Riesling. I don't remember what it's called. And I think it's a nice use of Riesling.
Yeah.
And yeah. Else have any questions or comments? Ruth has given you the link to a sensory scientist at the park at the Summerland Research and Development Center.
Awesome.
Yeah, hi Hannah. Thanks for your presentation. I'm just like hammering away an email to you right now, but I'll follow up with that with more info. But I haven't actually worked with Dr. Bajay, and I hope I'm saying that properly, but we are at UBC. I'm the coordinator for the Wine Research Center. We are at UBC. Dr. Wes Zandberg and myself are concocting a project that's like kind of spiraling out of control right now because we just keep finding more questions and avenues to explore. But we are speaking with Dr. Bajay and working with Karen from the TAC, the BCB TAC, and I'm not sure if you've spoken with them, but I'll connect you guys all via email. We're working on a smoke taint in Pinot Noir project, and one of the very first questions that we had was around sensory. So I shared her contact info because she has done a little bit of work specifically on wine, but I think her realm would be really good. I mean, benchmarking is always so challenging, right? Like we said, aroma is not just like our biology interacting with the chemistry of the product, but it's also, you know, our lived experience and whatever, you know, we can connect via memory, you know, what we've tasted, what we've smelled, where we grew up, like our frame of reference is all very, you know, subjective. So I just think it's going to be a really interesting project that we develop, and maybe there's some overlap and we can kind of leverage each other's whatever assets we're all bringing to the table. I don't know if there's some way to work together, but always looking to, you know, collaborate. So
yeah, that'd be great. I feel like especially the sort of all of the Canadian wine industry, so many things are sort of in a stage where more people with different experience and expertise is like always better.
yeah.
So yeah, totally. I think that's also what I'm sort of familiar with every part of the enology research world I've been in is like you need to find other people that are doing something that has some overlap and like run with that because
Yeah. And we all have like a tiny bit of money, but if we throw all our tiny bits of money in, you know, we might have enough to do a thing. So
yeah, totally.
okay. Awesome. I'll contact you
Okay,
shortly here.
great. Thanks, Ruth.
That's a good point, Ruth. If you were able to get a fizz club going, I think that would be hugely popular. It's a major gap that's expressed often that winemakers we don't get together enough, right? And you know, we used to have, you know, the VQA panel used to be only winemakers, and so there was frequent, like regular, you know, opportunities for group discussions that it doesn't really tend to happen otherwise. It has to be formalized a little bit, and you know, it's winemakers, so it's, you know, here we are with the cats, it's herding cats again. So so that would be really cool. And I think whatever the Wine Grape Council can do to help connect you that way, will do. So
yeah, that was like the biggest thing that I learned from I only went to 2 of the fizz clubs and sort of gave research updates of the stuff that I was working on at them. But people are so hungry for an opportunity to talk with each other, you know, not just like information highway, but I think it's also that like sharing of what's going well, what's not in a setting that everyone knows is also just winemakers, that there's no, you know, outside news
no
or
marketing,
like
marketing people there.
Totally, you can say it like it is, and get like very honest insight on things. A really nice opportunity.
And then the BCB TAC that Ruth referred to, I don't know if you know about that. It's at Okanagan College here in Penticton, but they have an awesome sensory tasting lab. So Ruth will hook you up with Karen, who directs that program. So
great.
That would be a great place if you're able to.
Very good. Perfect.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for coming. Your presentation will be within the next couple of days available on our website. And Isabella has been creating snippets of presentations for social media that I think are proving to be quite popular. So look to see, like and follow, you know. so that you can see those. Thanks again, Hannah.
No problem. And feel free to reach out to me. My email's there on the screen for anyone who has questions or follow-up or wants to chat a bit more about this too. I'm very happy to do that.
And if you miss it, contact Kate and she will, she can hook you up too. Our next meeting is in a month. Exactly, it's March 19th, the third Thursday of March. And BCAC and AgSafe will be doing a presentation on producer emergency awareness. So join us for that. And until then, thanks again, Hannah. And thanks everybody for coming. And we'll see you in a month.
Lovely. Thanks everyone for being here.